Erna Brodber's Myal, Exploring Jamaican Culture Beyond the Page. I'm thrilled that you decided to read this very important novel by Erna Brodber, an author who is often overlooked among other Caribbean writers. This book will present challenges to you. However, with careful attention to details and a few key concepts, you should be able to grasp the revolutionary, ingenious quality behind Brodber's design. Myal derives its title from an Afrocentric religious and spiritual belief system called Myalism. In its simplest form, Myalism operates as an opposite of a hex, which is meant to punish or hurt an individual. Myalism, on the other hand, evokes ideas of protection and reintegration into a community. These evocations try to counterbalance and rescue an individual from dangerous spirit forces or sorcery. As one scholar simplifies the term, Myal is good magic. In this novel, Brodber walks us through the rejuvenation of a protagonist's spirit and psyche. These processes of rejuvenation and recuperation are not easy ones for the protagonist or for us as readers. Still, I think this novel is an important one to read as it makes us start to see the world, the Caribbean, and especially Jamaica, from a new perspective. In this video, I will be exploring a little about Brodber's life, her artistic philosophy, and her literary achievements. Additionally, I'll be exploring Myal as a novel that challenges us to see beyond the page. For this idea, I argue that the novel is more than fiction. It operates as a treatise on spiritual, psychological, and cultural healing of peoples in the African diaspora. In this way, the book opens our eyes to a new world and a fresh take on Jamaican culture. Erna Brodber belongs among other post-colonial writers in Caribbean literature, for her works all deal with the consequences of colonialism and how those legacies still impact the lives of West Indians in our current age. This outlook makes her works share a common trait, which is the development of stories that address how colonialism, patriarchy, and slavery leave a lasting effect on characters, especially women, in her treatments on these topics. It is in this turn toward the feminist perspective, though, that makes me really appreciate her works. She tries to explain how women are particularly impacted by the legacies of those various oppressions. Moreover, her feminism is not always based on Western tradition. She asserts an African-based feminism that encourages a return to power balances between men and women and a shift toward an equilibrium with nature. I know that idea sounds complicated. However, as you read her works, this focus on balance and equilibrium should become more evident. Brodber also is unique because of her academic background. She is a trained and published sociologist and anthropologist who studies the cultural, historical, and spiritual connections among peoples within the African diaspora, especially between African Jamaicans and African Americans. Some of her sociological and cultural books include the following: The People of My Jamaican Village, 1817 to 1948. Woodside, Pear Tree Grove, P.O. The Second Generation of Freemen in Jamaica, 1907 to 1944. The Continent of Black Consciousness, on the history of the African diaspora from slavery to the present day. And Moments of Cooperation and Incorporation, African American and Afro-Jamaican Connections, 1782 to 1996. If you ever get the opportunity, please read these works. This academic background makes her fiction more challenging than other writers, in my opinion. Each novel makes an assumption that we as readers are as informed as its author. She assumes that readers will understand many of the cultural and sociological references in the works. While that may be the case for some of them, these references require readers to pay careful attention and to become active readers. I would encourage you to make notes as you read her works, so you can return to questions or references that may be unfamiliar to you. With more knowledge comes greater responsibility, to paraphrase a famous quotation by a famous person and character. Brodber uses her fiction as an imaginative extension of her scholarship, making worlds that embody her theoretical and critical concepts. In the slide above, you can see her novels as of 2022. Each novel introduces new experiences for readers. Each novel also complicates their understanding of Jamaica in exciting ways. For this reason, though, Brodber seems to put readers on our heels, questioning our relationships to quote-unquote truth. This quality has made Brodber describe her works as seemingly inaccessible at times. I hope this video will help you better understand her writings. Please see my other videos on Jamaican literature to learn about slavery, neocolonialism, and Rastafarianism. Before we turn to the novel, I think it is important to offer an explanation of a key concept in Brodber's scholarship. If I were to summarize her research in one word, I would use the word connection. Brodber is interested in how people are connected to place, and how that place with its history, spirit, and society connects to the person and the community. Moreover, she also does not divorce herself from the connective processes she studies. In other words, she allows herself to participate fully in her scholarly endeavors, to see how her identity connects to these places and those people. While a lot of her scholarship has dealt with Jamaica, she also writes about the connections between Jamaicans and African Americans, including the historical parallels between place names and plantations both in Jamaica and South Carolina and Louisiana specifically. I know that I've used the word spirit several times in this presentation. While this word has some quote-unquote magical connotations from the Western perspective, Brodber believes that there is some life force or spirit working behind the scenes in everything. Well, at least that spirit force appears to be one theme in her fiction. Therefore, the spirit of a person, people, place, or object may not be observed directly, although it could be, but it can be analyzed to reveal something impactful to its inhabitants. This shift in observation often corresponds to a concept called radical empiricism. Brodber also uses the term psychic anthropology. Let me explain this concept by turning to Brodber's novel, Louisiana. This book shares some thematic qualities with Myal, but it approaches them from a completely unique perspective. Louisiana embeds research and fieldwork into the study of the novel's protagonist. For those unfamiliar with the novel Louisiana, I'll offer this brief summary. Critic Ray Ann Merriweather explains, quote, "The plot of Louisiana is deceptively simple. It begins in 1936 with the journey of Ella Townsend, Columbia graduate student in anthropology, to St. Mary, Louisiana. She is provided with a tape recorder, very new technology at the time, and engaged to interview a matriarchal community figure named Mammy Sue Ann King in order to record the story of African Americans in this southwestern Louisiana area. Shortly after Ella arrives, Mammy dies, and her soul enters Ella at the funeral." Merriweather continues, quote, "At first, Ella's scientific training leaves her skeptical, but when she unexpectedly hears Mammy's and other unrecorded voices, including her own, on the tape reel, she begins to believe," end quote. After she and her husband move to Louisiana and seek the counsel of psychic Madame Marie, Ella begins to hear another voice, Mammy's spiritual sister, Afro-Jamaican Lowly Louise Grant, end quote. As can be gleaned, Louisiana fictionalizes and complicates anthropological fieldwork. On another level, the novel goes beyond this scenario because it demonstrates the connections between the U.S. South and Jamaica, an intentional objective for the book, according to Brodber. Quote, "Louisiana was a lecture to African Caribbean and African American people. I wanted to make the point that we have a long history of cooperating to produce diaspora culture, and it would suit us politically in the contemporary period to find a way back to each other and together face problems that are so similar," end quote. This lecture, disguised through fiction, only conveys this message as an immersive work that in some ways, quote, "invites the reader to participate in the research process," end quote. Consequently, Brodber states that as being an independent scholar, without institutional support at times, her, quote, First intellectual efforts were the novel Louisiana and the nonfiction work The Continent of Black Consciousness, end quote. Brodber states, quote, in these works I described mostly from imagination in the case of the novel, and mostly from secondary sources in the case of the nonfiction work, a past of cooperation between African Americans and Afro-Jamaicans, end quote. For instance, Brodber traces the genealogical and historical records of enslaved Africans from around the low country of South Carolina and Savannah, Georgia, originally property and land of British loyalists, who were forcibly removed to Palmetto Grove Plantation in St. Mary Parish, Jamaica. Additionally, Brodber, examining the evolution of abolitionist movements and repatriation literature in the 19th century, finds that Jamaica was a real and desirous destination for newly freed African Americans. As she explains, quote, immigration to Liberia had emerged out of the white American desire to cleanse American society of the people of African descent. Immigration to Jamaica would be the brainchild of African Americans and would be motivated by oneself rather than by those who wished for one to be removed, end quote. By exploring these connections, Brodber's academic work informs her fiction, allowing her to see African affinity all around the diaspora. In her imaginative works, which includes her fiction, Brodber wants to achieve the one major outcome of assisting her people, which she elaborates on in this quote, quote, my people are the African Jamaican people, the people who are the descendants of Africans enslaved in the New World, those of us who are very rarely portrayed in books or in films, and therefore do not really know very much about ourselves, because we haven't been doing the research on ourselves, nor have we been talking about ourselves. And I figured that the fiction, I tried the other thing, academic work, the fiction is easier to understand ourselves through, end quote. This quote reiterates my explanation earlier. Her fiction is a repackaging of her scholarship. In the slide above, I quote scholar Michael Jackson, obviously not the other famous one. In his explanation of radical empiricism, Jackson walks through the fine lines between subjectivity and objectivity in research. Brodber seems to accept that process, much like Zora Hurston did a generation before her. In many ways, Hurston is a spiritual mother or mentor for Brodber. Brodber's incantation of fieldwork in that book does not adhere to the accepted methods in the early 20th century study of anthropology. Like Zora Hurston, Brodber's main character was trained to see the world from a limiting point of view, where there is an either-or definition of the world. Michael Jackson explains this concept. For, quote, within the field of experience, a researcher comes down to either the subject or the object, theory or practice, the social or the individual, thought or feeling, form or flux. Therefore, when a researcher and author puts him or herself into the fieldwork, it sullies the experience, this argument goes. Therefore, when she exerts herself in her anthropological works, Tell My Horse, Mules and Men, and Bear a Coon, Zora Hurston breaks from traditional empiricism. As a great literary artist, though, Hurston makes herself an unnamed character in Bear a Coon, providing a vehicle for Cudjoe to tell his story as she prods him to confide in her as the silent but attentive reader. In the context of Bear a Coon, a book that chronicles the last enslaved Africans to enter the United States and Alabama in the 1850s, we need to know that Hurston brings Cudjoe, her subject of her research, a watermelon as an offering of grace and respect. While this act would be an interference in traditional anthropology, Hurston's insertion of herself into the story makes it more authentic and truthful. Because Hurston and Brodber embrace a non-Western and non-white way of speaking and observing, they challenge and expand the possibilities and rewards of fieldwork. By converting fieldwork and scholarship into fiction, both writers revolutionize storytelling and research simultaneously. Hurston and Brodber's distances from traditional empiricism to one that is more radical abandoned colonialist and racist legacies in sociology and anthropology. According to philosopher Emmanuel Chouaki Eze, traditional empiricism, quote, is historically linked to racism and forms of exploitation based on sex, religion, class, and ethnicity, end quote. Brodber's scholarship participates in radical empiricism, wherein interviewers, quote, are continually being changed by, as well as changing the experience for others. In other words, as Jackson notes, quote, the self cannot, therefore, be treated as a thing among things. It is a function of our involvement with others in a world of diverse and ever-altering interests and situations, end quote. Jackson explains the importance of this idea, quote, it stresses the ethnographer's interactions with those he or she lives with and studies, while urging us to clarify the ways in which our knowledge is grounded in practical, personal, participatory experience in the field as much as our detached observations, end quote. Emphasizing interplay and interaction, quote, a radically imperial method includes the experience of the observer and defines the experimental field as one of interactions and intersubjectivity, end quote. This shift on the interplay between observer and observed, subject and object, decentralizes the privileged position of the researcher in the fieldwork setting, making each participant important to the story. This shift also changes the end result of the fieldwork, for, as Jackson states, quote, knowledge belongs to the world of our social existence, not just to the world of academia. We must come to it through participation as well as observation, and not dismiss lived experience, end quote. This lesson takes time to develop for anyone in the field. Yet Brodber has learned to embody this outlook. While this outlook helps us to explain her novel Louisiana pretty well, I think it applies to Myla as well. Brodber's early research around the communities of Morant Bay and the fictionalized areas of Grovetown in the book inspired her to write the novel. In many ways, myth and history coalesce in Myla to tell a secret story in this community. For this reason and others, Myla reminds me of Edgar Meadowhauser's masterful novel, My Bones and My Flute, which uses the background of the Barbizon slave rebellion to tell a ghost story of Guyana. For more about this book, please watch my YouTube video. Before we turn our attention to the novel, I think it is important to discuss Myla and Myalism. This religious system can be traced to West African origins, and according to Monica Schuler, it has its roots in historical, transgenerational folk traditions, as she explains. Quote, even before leaving Africa as slaves, Africans associated malevolent sorcery with enslavement, devising fantastic symbolic tales and rumors about slave trafficking and slavery that acted as a critique of African and European slavers and slave owners. These tales describe slave dealers and owners as cannibals or vampires who consumed African flesh and blood and processed them into a variety of European and American goods, cheeses, red wines, and gunpowder, desired by continental Africans. Slaves took these beliefs to Jamaica, end quote. These associations with sorcery get transplanted in Jamaica, and Myalism gets translated from various African ethnic religions and practices during enslavement. Schuler again states, quote, Myalism, a religious movement that originated in the 18th century Jamaica, is the first documented Jamaican religion cast in the classical African mold, end quote. Schuler defines this movement as being most prominent from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s. In the slide above, there are several key quotes about this concept. The top quote directly connects to the novel in several ways. First, the character of Old African is brought in to help heal Anita. He is described as speaking a different language than the other characters. At one point, Brodber says that he has the ability to, quote, talk of things ancient and modern, end quote. Indeed, he uses the phrase, quote, the half has never been told, end quote, throughout the book to indicate an incomplete spiritual force working against the characters. Second, Miss Gather's tabernacle arrives to help Anita. The narrator describes the opening of this scene, quote, "There were men and women, all in dresses. White and red were the colors. Some wore a white dress with a red head tie, some a red dress with a white head tie, some a white dress with a white head tie, and others a red dress and a red head tie. The dress styles varied little, but the nature of the head tie, not at all. All with rabbit ears, all with pencils in the head tie on the right side, all yellow and newly sharpened. Then came the drums, their bum-batty, 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 bum, the next time on the program of music and recitation, that the Sunday morning offering to Grovetown's people, now captives in their own homes. And when the cutting and the clearing was done, and the spirits had recognized each other, and Miss Gather had been let into their tabernacle, singing 100 times louder than Miss Gather's had been, began. And the groaning and the dancing of so many feet tramping on the listener's mind." End quote. Brodber's description of this scene, which is similar to a traditional ring shout in African American culture, suggests a spiritual connection being formed in this community to help Anita. The singing, drumming, groaning, and dancing all combine to awaken the ancestors. The clothing depicted here also symbolizes the spiritual connections back to the ancestors. Through her entry into this space, Miss Gather is invoking Myal. It is important to see that this moment is not housed in Western Christian faith. As one scholar explains, quote, "The Myal notion of sin as sorcery, an offense not against God but against society, made it far more this world-oriented than the Baptist faith. Myal ritual offered a cure for society's ills, which, since they were caused by sorcery, could be eradicated by anti-sorcery ritual." End quote. The ritual performed in the novel corresponds to historical accounts of the Myal dance. Schuller recounts planter historian Edward Law's description of the Myal dance that enacted a ritual of death and rebirth. Brodber's skill to create the situation speaks to the novel's ability to represent Jamaican culture that goes beyond the page. For a more detailed analysis of this turn, please see Sylvia Winter's entry in the Encyclopedia of African Religions and Philosophy. The citation for this is located on my works cited page to come. I have several videos on Jamaica that go into more of the country's history and culture. However, before we move forward, this novel takes place in St. Thomas, Jamaica, in and around Morant Bay. The book also takes place in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States. The book is set during the beginning of the 20th century, around the time of the Great War or World War I. As we move forward to the novel, I want to offer a brief discussion of its structure. And when we talk about structure in literature, we're talking about the choices the author made in organizing the story. Structure is very important for any piece of literature because it allows readers to see how divergent parts are connected or disconnected. These connections may create patterns to help reveal the key themes in that work. While it is hard to understand at the time when you read it, the book also has 3 subplots that appear to come out of nowhere. Try not to be discouraged by these. Before we move forward, let me analyze some of these structural issues. Overall, Myal explores the life of Ella O'Grady Langley, a biracial young woman who falls ill due to, quote, spiritual thievery, a concept we will return to shortly. Brodber's characterization of Ella is important because she represents many similar people throughout the Caribbean at the time. Because Jamaica was a British colony during the novel's setting, many subjects from around the empire populated the islands. The fact that Ella is biracial fits into that historical record. Most significantly, her biracial background stigmatizes her in black society, which we see during her school days with teasing and the song the kids make about her. Teachers do not treat her well either. Brodber lets us see how society views her, as the narrator says, quote, "It was hard for Ella. It was hard for the district people, and the skin so sensitive. It was a rebuke to the very elements, end quote. This rebuke of the elements foreshadows how Ella's spirit becomes linked to the natural world as the book continues. Although it is not her fault, her appearance causes a rift among members of society. Her appearance also causes Nadine Braserton to take it upon herself to quote-unquote adopt Ella and to take her away from her mother. Brodber borrows this plot element from fellow Jamaican writer Claude McKay in his masterpiece Banana Bottom. In another similarity, McKay's protagonist goes abroad to continue her education. Ella in our novel goes abroad, but appears not to gain any educational value. Instead, she becomes the trophy wife and muse for Selwyn Langley, her eventual husband. In McKay's novel, the protagonist returns to Jamaica and has the opportunity to grow into her black identity and roots. Ella, though, does not get that opportunity because her spirit has been stolen and injured. As you read the book, you will notice that Ella's story seems to disappear at times. Again, Brodber structurally separates Ella's plot from the other characters to show that spiritual thievery can take on many forms. The most developed subplot belongs under this category. Anita's story seemingly appears in the book from nowhere. As a critical, active reader, I hope you will not just dismiss this shift as an error or mistake on the author's part. Moreover, Anita's situation also seems strange. After all, rocks pelted her home constantly for no apparent reason at first. Although this uses elements of magical realism, a common technique and style in post-colonial literature, the rocks indicate nature has become unbalanced and that Anita's spirit is being damaged. I think Brodber puts Anita's plot in the novel to show that Ella is not the only one suffering from this thievery. Because she sets the novel around the Great War, or World War I, Brodber makes the case that lots of spirits are out of balance and in danger. This, so to speak, butterfly effect, to borrow from chaos theory, arrives in Jamaica in unique ways. To help solidify my point, let me offer one key quote regarding Anita's subplot. Through the voices of the community, Brodber has a character summarize her situation, which the narrator says, quote, "It was the child, Anita, who had brains and was bright and was looking like she was going to go far. Bad-minded people wanted to take away the child's spirit. And didn't old Africans say, the half has never been told? That meant it could happen again," end quote. A bad-minded person wants to take Anita's spirit to become stronger and smarter. In many ways, Anita's subplot represents the plight of many people living in a colony during the novel's setting. Significantly, Anita gets rescued by the community. Something similar will need to happen with Ella. If you pay attention to Anita's storyline, you will be able to piece together Ella's life and her journey in and out of spiritual thievery. Here are some of the important characters in the novel. I've tried to give a brief identification of each to help you understand them. Before I conclude our discussion, it is important to understand how spiritual thievery operates in the novel. I will not be discussing any specific characters' situations in this video, but I do want to discuss this concept. Ella's spirit is stolen by her husband's actions, as she thinks about it by narrating, quote, "He took everything I had away, made what he wanted of it, and gave me back nothing," end quote. This quote aligns with two principles of spirit thievery, according to the fable. Quote, "The two first principles of spirit thievery, let them feel that there is nowhere for them to grow to, stunt them. Let them see that their brightest ones as the dumbest ever, alienate them," end quote. Stunt and alienate them. While this is not exactly an analogy for colonialism, it does provide some context for spiritual thievery. Most important to me about these principles is how subtle they can be. A person may not know they are being stolen from until it's too late. I think this idea is reflected in the top quote above. Western education often focuses on uniformity and conformity. It often can divorce someone from their linguistic and cultural roots. Ella is quick to try to change that practice by the novel's end. The second quote reinforces this belief, yet it also adds immorality to spiritual thievery. This immoral turn is what we most often associate with zombies. For a typical depiction of zombification, I would recommend viewing the 1932 classic film, White Zombie. My initial position on this book is that it helps us understand Jamaica beyond the page. In Myal, we learned that reintegration of the community can counteract evil forces to help improve and heal a person's spirit. As a means of conclusion, I offer the two quotes above. In the top quote, Rupert Lewis offers a tremendous appraisal of Brodber's career. I hope you can find these concepts in Myal. In the bottom quote, Brodber writes that her aesthetic objective is to celebrate the connections and knowledges we have. I hope this slide offers a way to see more connections to other Caribbean novels and authors. Here are some sources to consider for more information.